few more seconds, everybody. All right, it's 12:30. Hello, everyone. So today we start our presentations and we're going to be covering the first chapter of the Fat Talk book, which is more evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. Both Emma and Meg are going to be presenting. And so Emma, if you're ready, you can go ahead and share screen and get moving.
Okay. Okay, so we're talking about Fat Talk, a feminist perspective, and I have pages 9 through 15 of chapter 1, the evolution of Fat Talk. So the chapter begins with this quote, "We recognize that we are collective agents of history and that history cannot be deleted like web pages." Angela Davis, American political activist, scholar, and author. So what do you think this quote means?
I love Angela Davis.
Any thoughts on what this quote would mean?
I'm going to take a stab at it, but I like to think of it as like there's a lot of history that we oftentimes like leave out of textbooks, and a lot of it is around women and what they've done. So
yeah, that's really good. I didn't think about that. I thought about how we like all play a role in our history, and so we can't change the past, but we can learn and grow from it. So yeah, I think it's a really inspired quote. So how does this relate to Fat Talk, this quote? Any thoughts?
Yes, they're asking to repeat the quote.
Yeah,
You can take a look at it again and spend a little more time absorbing it. Yeah.
So we recognize that we are collective agents of history and that history cannot be deleted like web pages.
You can't undo what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say is like, I remember growing up, my mom was always like, do a double take before you say like something to someone. Even if like, you know, you're in middle school or high school and like bullying comes into play, like kind of remember like what you're saying to someone because they could be having like more problems behind closed doors that could be like a trigger for them.
Yeah, that's really good. So I think it relates to Fat Talk because it is part of our evolutionary history, which we will discuss more later. However, it has continued into our present. It's still here, and we're writing our own history today. And so I'm hoping one day Fat Talk will just be a part of the past. So any other thoughts about that? Okay, so let me share screen. Okay, so I have a short Mean Girls clip I'm going to play.
God, my hips are huge. Oh, please, I hate my calves. At least you guys can wear halters. I've got man shoulders.
I used to think there was just fat and skinny. Apparently, there's a lot of things that can be wrong on your body.
My hairline is so weird. My pores are huge. I know, but suck. I have really bad breath in the morning. Ew.
So that clip gives us some good examples of Fat Talk. Okay. So Fat Talk defined. Let me move that. Okay. So Fat Talk is any negative, critical, or derogatory talk about oneself that is pertaining to your physical appearance. So it can be about body fat, weight, shape, style, fitness, anything about your physical appearance. And in fat talk conversations, they're often conducted in group conversations with friends or just any group of women. And often in these conversations, there's internal conflict. So my next question is, why would women be conflicted about fat talk?
In your reflections, I saw a lot of you, I felt the tension that a lot of you have been experiencing. So can anybody articulate that?
So from what I picked up on the reading, basically it was saying that like in the short term, it provides like relief and like community feeling, but then in the long term, it causes lower self-esteem.
Exactly, yes. And so women, they feel pressure to join in with their friends, but then most women know that they shouldn't be saying negative things about themselves. And that's seen in the Mean Girls clip. Caddy doesn't really want to join in with them, but they're all looking at her, waiting for her response. So there's that conflict between not wanting to put yourself down, but wanting to build those relationships. Okay. So, and the perceived purpose of fat talk, getting to what you just noted. So it elicits social support, and you share appearance critiques. So those are perceived purpose. And it's a normative phenomenon. So people expect short-term relief. They get that short-term relief, building interpersonal intimacy. However, in the long term, there are very serious harms, and it acts like an addiction. So people can feel better about feeling bad about their bodies, and that it's this compulsive action. Like you get the short-term relief, but then there's long-term harm, but it's addictive because you want that short-term relief. So what is the contextual purpose of fat talk? So evolution plays a big role, which we will talk about later, but so does the culture. And so fat talk is a symptom of a larger societal problem. So what do you think are some of the societal problems that have contributed to fat talk? Any thoughts on that?
The idealization of thin and like
Yes.
thin body types.
Definitely. Any other thoughts?
The really high and specific standards for women's beauty.
Definitely, yeah. So inequality is one of the societal problems, which is largely attributable to oppression by others. However, women play a small role in that. By using fat talk and body snarking, it contributes to that inequality. And then sexism and misogyny are also societal problems that all help build fat talk and body snarking. So what are some long-term consequences that you can think of that are a result of fat talk?
Lower self-esteem.
Definitely. Yes. If you're tearing yourself down with fat talk, you can't have high self-esteem. Any other thoughts?
I think continued fat talk for like a while, or like an eating disorder.
Yes, it's addictive, acts like an addiction, so you want to continue it. So depression, poor body image, eating disorders, body shame, social anxiety, and low self-esteem all are consequences of fat talk in the long term. Okay. So social scientists have looked at women versus men, and they have found that women have much higher body image dissatisfaction compared to men. And these anthropologists have looked at research with Caucasian middle school girls and mothers, and they coined the term fat talk, which is a ritualized and reciprocated discourse. So it's ritualized because it's so ingrained in our culture, And it's reciprocated because women, when they engage in it, they expect other women to engage in it with them, like in the Mean Girls clip. And then they support them, but then they also chime in with their own fat talk. So it's just continuing that process for all women. Okay. All right, so Becker and colleagues did an international online study with women of a wide adult age range. And they found that 81% of women occasionally use fat talk and 33% frequently report using fat talk. And so in another study with mostly Caucasian college women, they found that 93% of women engage in fat talk. So given these high percentages of frequency of fat talk, what do you think are some future areas of research based on this that you would like to know about?
Maybe like the age ranges of people that engage in fat talk, like if it starts like at a really young age, or if it's more just like prevalent in high school and stuff, and then maybe if it ever like drops off into adulthood or not.
That would be very interesting, yes. Any other thoughts?
I'd like to see like a correlation with like media consumption, like people who frequently read magazines or like browse social media compared to how much they engage in fat talk.
Yes, that would be good.
And that we call that social comparison, and that's going to be coming up.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there's much more research throughout the rest of the book, but any other thoughts? There's still more areas that need research, I'm sure too.
One of the things that I've done with some of you've had Dr. Bazzini as an instructor. And one of the things that we've been collaborating on are other forms of self-derogatory talk. Does this fit into a norm for women to just present themselves as very humble, as an example?
And so I also thought it would be interesting to see the differences in women that intentionally use fat talk versus unintentionally. Like, you know what fat talk is, you're aware of it, and you still use it, or if you don't know what it is. And then once you know the term, if you engage in it less, and what strategies use to kind of change that your talk after you know about it. So let's share. Okay. All right, so Dr. Deborah Tannen was she is a sociolinguist. And so she looked at the differences between US women and men in general speech. And she wrote a book called You Just Don't Understand Women and Men in Conversation. And so in that book, she talks about women and girls' conversations and their motivations and benefits for their conversations. And so those include closeness, confirmation and support, and consensus. And so all of these fit with fat talk, making it a feminine dialogue, because when women use fat talk, they're wanting to build those relationships, and they also want support. So saying the opposite, saying like, you're beautiful, you're not fat. And they reach consensus because all the women, they'll all share their fat talk and then support them, but that's continuing the fat talk. So the US cultural norm for women, if you're confident, it's viewed as arrogant. And then if you're too humble, it's viewed as insecure. And so we have to balance between these two as women in the US. And this creates uniformity and it limits diversity and individuality. So what do you think is the difference between confidence and arrogance?
Good question.
Confidence is like when you feel really good about yourself and you're proud of yourself, and then arrogance is more along the lines of like, I think I'm better than most people.
Yes, that's good. So I think it's important to note that women and men can be either or, confident or arrogant, but confidence means you're self-assured, you're confident in your skills, your views, whatever you feel good about yourself. However, arrogance is when you feel superior and you want to put others down. And so I think misogyny is a great example of arrogance. And confidence is a wonderful trait in women, so it shouldn't be just written off as arrogance. So yes, Dr. Marks.
I follow up to that, Emma. Do you all think that women's confidence at times is intimidating to men? Okay. Unanimous yes.
Definitely, yes. And I think I've encountered more arrogant men than I have women. So I think it's kind of funny that women's confidence is construed as arrogance. So what would be the difference between being humble and being insecure? Any thoughts?
Sophie, we can't hear you, but we see your mouth moving.
I do not know why it is. Can y'all hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I'm driving home, or I'm riding in the car, so it's gone. But anyways, I think, being humble is you're still sure of yourself, but you're just not trying to like assert yourself in that mode of being arrogant, if that makes sense. So like being humble is just you're sure of yourself, but you're not like just putting it all out there for everyone to see. But being insecure is when you're really like unsure of yourself and like not really sure how to express yourself, and just you're lacking that confidence, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. So humility can be a positive trait if it means a lack of arrogance and sharing the spotlight with others. So supporting women instead of tearing them down through body snarking would be an example of being humble. However, insecurity is when you don't have any self-confidence and a lot of uncertainty and anxiety. And so men can also be insecure. And so what negative impact could this focus on uniformity instead of diversity have on women in our culture?
I think about it as we feel pressure to walk a thin line, that it's not the flexibility.
Definitely. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I think it causes women to remain in the cultural norm. So if women accept this cultural norm, then it slows down female advancement as a whole. And so the more women that accept that, then fewer women are going to be breaking glass ceilings and accomplishing new and great things, the more that it just accepts those as the norm. Anything else?
Yeah, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but like I fluctuate between like humble, like confident, like I know there are differences, but like sometimes I'm on a spike. So like either fluctuations can get like really big or like really small, and I don't like feel anything, if that makes any sense. But
yeah, and we can be both humble and confident. Like if humility is not, trying to steal the spotlight from others, not being arrogant, and then you can be confident. You can have both, and you don't have to be arrogant and insecure. You can just be humble and confident. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Here we go. All right. So women and men. Women are supposed to be humble and non-competitive, and men are supposed to be confident and competitive. And women are conversations foster relationships, whereas men's foster status. They're trying to build up their status. And so these cultural norms foster fat talk. So what are some ways that these cultural norms foster fat talk, where we're supposed to be humble, non-competitive, and focusing on relationships, while men are competitive and confident and building up status?
They can use their language to compete with one another, like sort of men ribbing on one another, which I find to be really enjoyable. But I've also know that like I can't rib my female friends that same way. because I will hurt them. And so even though I enjoy it, that's why I kind of like enjoy my boys and I enjoy being around men at times, just to be able to kind of hear that kind of dialogue.
Yeah. So Fat Talk gives women this common ground to build relationships instead of competing against each other. And they're maintaining humility by pointing out their perceived flaws. But when women communicate through Fat Talk, they're building a community with harm, because they're objectifying themselves through Fat Talk. And that leads to more objectification, more sexism, more misogyny. But men often build community without harm through talking about sports and things like that. So what would be like a solution to this would be finding other conversations women can or do have, that they can have that common ground instead of Fat Talk. So any ideas, what are some other conversations women can have to replace Fat Talk?
Sophie, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
Now we can.
Okay, sorry. But thinking about it, and I know I wrote this some in my reflection, but I think that, you can use like encouragement and like health versus body image, and so like I know something that I really struggled with when I like began working out. It was to make my body look a certain way. But now I look at it and it's like, okay, I need to like maintain a healthy weight for like, fertility or for heart health and stuff like that. So I guess just like conversations around that. And I know me and my roommates work out together a lot, and we're able to encourage each other, and like we're lifting, you're squatting this much versus this much, and it has nothing to do with like the size of our body, but just like how healthy and strong we are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Anything else? And so women can also talk about sports or politics if they're interested in that, and like finding common ground that should be fairly easy to do on a college campus. If we're in psychology classes together, we can talk about psychology. We can talk about our careers, our school, everything like that. There's so many other options than Fat Talk. Okay. So evolutionary context of Fat Talk. So evolutionary psychology is human psychological structure and behavioral tendencies. And evolutionary biology looks at how human anatomy and physiology have evolved. And so whenever looking at anything in evolutionary context, you have to look at what has been adaptive and what has been maladaptive. And so a lot of anatomy, physiology, and behaviors have been adaptive, such as opposable thumbs, color. We're able to see color, so that promotes the rainbow diet, which is healthier for us, and sex drive, making it easier to reproduce. And fight, flight, or freeze has been adaptive, but has also been maladaptive. So can anybody think of some examples when fight, flight, or freeze would be adaptive versus maladaptive? Either or.
I would say adaptive going into sports competition. So for any of you who played sports, a lot of times you kind of psych yourself up before a game or a match or a race or whatever.
I would say maladaptive is like test anxiety.
Yes.
And response.
Definitely. Any other thoughts?
Another in the chat, in times of stress when your immune system shuts down, when the stress is prolonged and the fight or flight or freeze just drains you. Yeah.
Definitely. That's terrible. Okay, so our feminine enemies are evolutionary remnants. So Fat Talk and body snarking are still here from evolution, but they are very maladaptive in our contemporary context. So signal theory. Fat Talk shows that you care about your physical attractiveness and worry about how you measure up. And so in signal theory, there are beauty signals which send signals of youth, vibrance, and health. But when there's a lack or the opposite of beauty signals, it sends signals of deformity, injury, and disease. And so when we see this lack of beauty signals, we fear and we have empathy. So if you see someone sick or injured, you feel empathy for them, but you also feel fearful that you could be sick or injured just by being near them. And so this also fosters victim blaming, very harmful in our society. So if you can feel empathy for a victim, but then you also feel fearful because you're afraid that you could also become a victim. And so that's why people search for what did the victim do wrong to become a victim, so we can avoid that. And so that is why we have victim blaming. So what can we do? Acknowledge the problem. We have to acknowledge the problem of fat talk, and we have to acknowledge the role we play in it. So if we participate in fat talk, or if we participate in body snarking, that's the first thing. We have to acknowledge there's a problem and the role we play in it. And then only after that can we address the fat talk. So what are some ways that you can think of that we could address fat talk after acknowledging it and the role we play in it?
I think one way is a big part of fat talk is like seeing other people say something bad about their own bodies and then people respond with saying something bad about theirs. Instead, I think we could reassure each other instead of like speaking bad about ourselves, but reassure one another.
Definitely, yes. Yep, support your friend, but not engage in the fat talk yourself. Yeah. Anything else?
I've seen the term, I think it's called like body realism, being like thrown around recently, where instead of like trying to 180 flip your perspective and be like, oh, my body is perfect and everything is perfect, it's kind of like, oh, I have a body and it works just fine and it's mine. So taking like that road could be like an easier stepping stone instead of just like, oh, I'm perfect, because it's kind of like unrealistic sometimes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Be like thankful for everything our bodies can do. Yeah, instead of focusing on other things. That's great. Yeah. Anything else? And if we have time, I have another video about just kind of what fat talk is and some examples of it. Okay.
I have slender thighs. Ugh, the shirt makes me look big. My face is so fat.
Hi, I'm Cassidy Joe. Recently, I heard a statistic that said 93% of women fat talk, but I wasn't quite sure what that meant. After all, what is fat talk anyway? So I decided to ask therapist Franny Ritter about what fat talk is, and then follow up with my peers to see if they had any ideas about this unrecognized epidemic.
Fat talk is most commonly done by females, but it's a way of devaluing and putting oneself down pertaining to their weight.
At first, I had no clue as to what fat talk is. I actually had to ask someone, but they finally told me it's just the negative way girls talk about themselves.
I think fat talk is like when girls just talk negative about their body or other people's bodies.
Fat talk is critiquing yourself harshly based on your appearance more than like the talents that you possess.
Like most girls, I'm really self-conscious about my weight and my body. I've felt overweight and like a big girl for a really, really long time.
When I was 11 or 12, my uncle said something to my mom about how I looked a little chubby in a swimsuit.
And sometimes I feel like I look very like manly and not like a girl. I wish that I could be a little bit thinner, mainly I want to build a little bit more muscle.
I don't think my body is the size I want it to be yet, just because I'm not fully confident with how I look yet. So I'm still working on it.
My first time when I felt bad about myself is when I was 12 years old, and I had some friends, and they would talk about like they bought their body and the way like they didn't like how they were, and so I would like look at myself and say, oh wow, I don't really like this about myself or that. I kind of got influenced.
When I really started to get self-conscious about it, I think it was about 15, an awkward stage. You know, I didn't know what to do with my Italian eyebrows and my braces and glasses, and I started filling out, and I was just so self-conscious. And I'm klutzy, that doesn't help, but it's hard.
Words have meaning, and words are very powerful. Some of the consequences can be eroded self-esteem, anxiety, depression. It can affect one professionally as well as relationship-wise.
With magazines trying to portray the perfect body, like the hourglass figure, the hot bikini bodies, really that just lowers our self-esteem because we view ourselves as, I don't look like that, I don't look like that. So we tend to use that as our fuel to fat talk.
I just wish that there were magazines or models who were willing to put their foot down and say, no, don't airbrush me. And I'm not talking about a little pimple here and there, actually changing the shape of their body to make them thinner or curvier. And saying that that's natural and that's how we should look is probably one of the most messed up things in the beauty industry ever.
When people see it like in the newsstands, they just think, oh, like I want to look like that, and they start comparing themselves to that, like to how other like models look.
Social media heavily influences a physical appearance a lot, and it can lead to harsh consequences if taken seriously.
Social media is a way of checking with others to make sure what we're thinking and what we're saying is okay. But if we check with others who have distorted ideas about what's healthy, we can take on some really unhealthy ideas. So unhealthy ideas can spread very quickly through social media. We really need to compliment other people on things that come from within, character qualities, not how groovy their jeans look. And we need to develop those within ourselves. And if we can start with ourselves, then maybe we can change our culture.
Now that I understand fat talk is making negative comments about your body and that there are serious consequences that go along with it, I plan to make this issue recognized by as many people as possible. So spread the word, and remember, you're all beautiful.
Okay, so that was the end of my presentation. Does anybody have anything else to say about that?
Let's have Meg present, and then at the end we can kind of just pull it all together, baby.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So my presentation focuses on pages 16 through 23. And starting off with this portion of chapter 1, the book kind of discussed how humans tend to draw more toward attractive faces. And this even starts out when humans are babies. So they found when people viewed images of someone who looked more like a human prototype versus like someone who had very unique features, they thought the person who looked more of like a human prototype with average features were more attractive. And this can be explained by evolutionary theory. Images with people who have like very unique features were more associated with like harmful genetic mutations, where people who looked more average seemed to have better genes because they'd been passed down through like natural selection. So this kind of creates a sense of like security. So if you're looking more average, it's more secure. So let's see. Sorry, I didn't. Okay. So if humans tend to draw more toward people with attractive faces, why is beauty more important for girls and women? So starting off, women and men seem to have different preferences when looking for a potential mate. On page 18, it says sexual mate selection involves the attraction to certain qualities in a partner that bode well for oneself personally and possible future children for both men and women. So this is going to kind of lead into the study that I found. The study in the book was conducted by Buss in 1989, and he assessed what heterosexual men and women's preferences were when selecting a human mate. So the data was collected from like 37 different countries, and the participants were to rate 18 characteristics on like a scale from 0 to 3. 0 was like irrelevant to them, and then 3 was like indispensable. Some examples of the characteristics were like dependable character, intelligence, and sociability. So for the results, men seem to care more about a woman's physical appearance and like her reproductive capacity, while women cared about qualities such as like security, dependability, and ability to make money. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to ask y'all, were you surprised about like these results? Like, were you surprised that like men seem to care more about physical appearance? Yeah, I wasn't surprised either. I think because like this creates like more pressure for women ultimately to like look more attractive, since men are caring more about like appearance overall. Share my screen again. So pretty much like because like women cared about qualities like dependability and like security, this kind of points to like mate selection could have very different consequences like for men and women. So for example, like men can impregnate a woman in seconds, and their only obligation is to be taking care of the child like after birth. But for a woman, it's much different. She's going to be more invested emotionally and like physically. So like carrying the baby, like birthing the baby, taking care of the baby after birth. So I think this overall tells like why women would be drawn to men who exhibit qualities like being secure and being dependable and being fond of children.
And Meg, I would add to that, there's so many more women who are single parents than men who are single parents. And then even in relationships where both parents are there, women usually do a lot more of the household work and a lot more of the childcare. So, I mean, it is a much greater cost for women.
Yeah,
than men.
absolutely. So the next point I'm going to talk about is like moving into why much of our body fat or body talk focuses on fat. Evolutionary theory also has some explanation behind this. Women who are seeming to like maintain a thinner build and like a thinner frame are perceived as younger and more fertile to men. So like ultimately the woman's like hip or waist to hip ratio is more important to men. For them, it can tell them information about like a woman, like their attractiveness and like how fertile they are. So like if a woman has a larger waist, it might signal that she has some certain disease, which could be connected to, reducing her fertility, or it could also signal to like a potential mate that a woman has already had a child with another man, so that might turn them away. But overall, I think this kind of idea that women need to have a smaller waist and like a thinner build really ties into the ideal body type that women are supposed to have. And I'm gonna stop share. And I'm gonna ask y'all, how do you feel about kind of the waist to hip ratio being so important to men? And like, how do you feel about like the ideal body type that women are supposed to have in our society?
When I was doing research on this, I was surprised. I had heard about evolution, waist hip ratio, that kind of thing, but I was surprised that it exists regardless of body size. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a lean woman. It could be quite a curvy woman, but there's still that attraction to that type of dimension.
I found it really interesting how the study that was looking at the different characters in cartoons or on TV actually have smaller hip to waist ratios than like what men find attractive in the other study. I just found it interesting how like the portrayal is much thinner than maybe even like what men find attractive.
And Walt Disney World has been exaggerating those kind of attributes all throughout history since they've existed. Yep.
Anybody else?
How many of you just dislike this? Like, even I reread this yesterday, and as I reread it, it's like, I don't like this, but it's just, I mean, it's so strong in the science. Like, you can't deny it, is kind of how I feel about it. But are there others of you who are like, I don't like this?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
And then lastly, I'm gonna kind of touch on the double standard, which I'm really, this kind of portion of the chapter talked about a little bit. But, you know, women are judged more often when they have more sexual partners. They're often called sluts, other harmful nicknames, body shamed, probably body snarked by other women. But men are often praised for having more sexual partners and kind of patted on the back by their friends and other people. But the chapter discussed like how we see the double standard in like 13 Reasons Why and like a few other media examples. But I was going to ask y'all if you can think of like other examples of the double standard that we see in like media or in our society in general.
I feel like you can even see it with how parents treat their daughters versus sons, even in that respect. I feel like parents are much more protective over their daughters and like them going out versus their sons have a little bit more freedom.
Yeah, it's interesting how parents like they're more protective of their daughters. They don't want them getting pregnant. They don't want them getting sexually transmitted disease. But then there's the boys will be boys. Like, it's okay for them to have fun. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was one example. I think it was like I saw on Instagram once where like Justin Bieber posted a photo and he was like shirtless and like all the comments were like, "You're so attractive, blah blah blah." And then like Demi Lovato posted a picture and she was like in a bathing suit or something and all the comments were like, "You need to put on more clothes, like you're a slut," like etc. So I thought that was pretty awful. But kind of closing out, I also wanted to ask like what was something that you guys thought was like interesting in this whole chapter? Like, it doesn't have to be in like my portion, or just something that you learned.
I think for me, I just noticed like the prevalence of like fat talk and body snarking. I think I'm like, at least for me personally, I've gotten to a point where like I look past it oftentimes in like social media. Like, I don't actively seek it out or like look at like mean comments or anything like that. But just like knowing how much it's there and like now and in history is really bizarre, eye-opening.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and like kind of going off of that, like with the Mean Girls example and stuff, like I've seen that movie so many times, but you never really think twice about it just because like it's a really popular movie and everyone knows about it. But that's just kind of an example again about like how it's so prevalent and like how we don't even realize it sometimes because we're just almost so like used to it or immune to it, which I think it's good that we're like starting to recognize it and trying to like change the narrative.
Yeah, definitely. I think oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Has anybody had the experience yet where you're realizing, oh, I do this, I didn't realize I do this, or oh, I hear this around me and I didn't realize what I was hearing?
I often found myself thinking about it, but I won't say it out loud, but I'll catch myself thinking about it and I'll be like, oh, did I really just think that? Like I wasn't even paying attention, but that's just where my brain went.
All right, I think that's all I have.
Okay. Were there other things, and I'm curious about the evolutionary psych and biology stuff that surprised you all or you didn't know about before or you didn't like, you didn't like the results? There was one of the studies, one of the bus studies, and he's the big evolutionary guy, where he asked these couples who were happy in their relationships what they found most important in a heterosexual mate. And number one was it good looking was number one, and then something like good cook, and then number three was something like it was another attractiveness item. Like it landed on multiple items there, but then the good cook, like she's got to feed me. And then there was another one, what, frugal, she's not going to spend all my money, she's not going to be a gold digger. Yeah. Any other things like just like disturb you all about some of that research?
Can you all hear me?
Uh-huh.
Okay, just want to make sure before I start talking. But something that I found interesting, and I think it was in I think it was in chapter 1, but now I'm wondering if it was or the preface. But it was talking about how they gave men this like question like if they find women, I guess, being confident as attractive, or if like how fat talk kind of changes their view on a woman. And they found that like high levels of fat talk was like really not attractive to men. And I think that's something that's like you don't really think about, and you think that a lot of times when we're fat talk we do it to women, but also like that's something that I have caught myself doing it with like my boyfriend before, like talking bad about my body, and it's something that you don't really think about it being unattractive like to a man, it's right. And so I thought that was kind of interesting and just very like eye-opening to me to like watch and try to be like more confident in my body, I guess. So
there's an interesting balance there though, Sophie, and this is very timely because my former master's student, Cassidy Miles Sandoval, we're about to submit her manuscript to her relationship journal, and she did some of this research. Men tend to perceive minimal levels of fat talk and self-accepting talk exactly the same. And it's probably, we've got the signaling theory that a small amount of fat talk with a male mate probably means I care about my appearance, or I care about my appearance for you too. But excessive levels of fat talk, people tend to perceive the relationship as being poor, and they perceive their sexual satisfaction as being poor. So it's a matter of level. And when I think about those minimal levels, that's where I kind of go into the normative part. It's just so common and normal to hear it a little bit. But wouldn't it make sense? What do you all think for women? If you had a friend, a woman friend who was doing this all the time, or even a male friend that was body talking, which tends to be more the lack of muscular talk. If you had somebody around you doing this a lot, would that be a turnoff? Yeah. Yes, we need more research on kind of that law. But I do find it interesting that minimal fat talk is viewed the same as somebody who's saying confident things about themselves. That to me speaks to the norm, but it seems like the excessive levels have a different kind of an effect. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting, like also on the flip side of things, you know, like the minimal fat talk is like ideal, I guess, for men, but then I think like no fat talk at all is, again, you know, going back to the arrogance thing, like a woman that doesn't talk about her body bad at all is like seen as arrogant. And so it get like all just kind of ties back around to the evolutionary and like the misogynistic part of it. So I just thought that.
One of the things that I found interesting in reading about and pulling this kind of scholarship, and I had a class that focused pretty heavily on evolutionary stuff as an undergrad, and I remember thinking it was just really interesting, like, oh, that's why, you know, people tend to do these things. But I found it very interesting that nowadays, even when we're capable of, if we're in a heterosexual relationship, of controlling our reproduction, how those evolutionary forces, as if you're finding somebody to have babies with, still operate. Like, isn't that interesting? Or women feeling like they have to be the gatekeeper to sex. Isn't that interesting? Even if she's assured she's not going to get an STI, she's not going to get pregnant. There's that, like, you know, that women being the gatekeepers more than men being the pursuers kind of thing. So I just find that really interesting, in that even in modern day research, we're still oftentimes wired and operating in a way that benefits our evolutionary success. And it isn't quite like caught up to modern times. What do you think all of this, because I want to branch out a little bit. What do you think all of this, because again, we've been talking about heterosexual mate selection and reproduction. What do you think this has to do with individuals who are much more flexible in their own gender identity, much more flexible, perhaps bisexual, pansexual in who they're attracted to? Do you think these forces play out, or do you think they're different?
I don't know, I like this question, but I'm not 100% sure, but in another one of my classes, and I think we actually touched on it in here too, we were talking about how actually in like the LGBTQ community, there's more prevalent like domestic violence and stuff. And so even though I feel like sometimes those people, we might perceive them as more like sure of themselves or confident in themselves, at the same time, like there's a lot of like in a relationship, like violence and like stuff like that. So I don't know if that would be like a factor that like plays into like something where they're not actually fully confident in themselves or like their partner.
Well, and we see domestic violence and interpersonal violence everywhere, you know, regardless of individuals' demographics. Certainly there are some individuals that are more at risk, and LGBTQ are more likely to be victims. As are people of color are more likely to be victims. And then there's that whole kind of, like we talked a bit about, that cycle of violence, that if you're a victim, you're a little less likely to recognize red flags in the future. If you've been a victim, you're more likely to think that that's normal and that's how you behave when there's conflict. So a lot of complicating factors there. Yeah. I remember having a conversation with a straight guy, and we were reflecting on some of the lesbian women that we knew, and his comment, and it took me a while to kind of absorb it and think about it, but he was like, why, he's like, if it's a woman who's attracted to a woman, and this is just a stereotype, this is not all lesbian women, obviously, but if it's a woman who's attracted to a woman, why do they try to look like men? You know, and he's kind of referring to that sort of butchy look. And, you know, at first it was kind of like, you've got a point, but then after I mulled over it, it's like, because there's just not that investment of needing to look a certain feminine way. Maybe it's a more natural look for women, you know, not trying to style hair and do makeup and dress in skirts or dresses and that kind of thing. You know, maybe it's just a flexibility, not, you know, an intent kind of thing. What do y'all think about that?
I definitely don't think it's an intent. I think it's just our bias on how genders should look, the like stereotypical, which I don't agree with in our society. So I think people who break out of that, people inside of that like bias, look at them differently and then try to fit them into the box that they just don't fit into. So
yeah. Other thoughts on that comment?
I'm in psychology of gender right now. So we've been talking a lot about this kind of thing. And I think that something that I would like to see more of are studies and research that focus around not just like heteronormative views, or not just like lesbian or gay studies that just focus on women who like women or men who like men, but people who are like non-binary and people who are pansexual or bisexual, who like a variety of people, and what that means for like attractiveness and like what you find attractive in a partner. I think it'll be really interesting, hopefully in the next couple of years, to see research actually like come out about that.
Yeah. Has Dr. Ballard talked at all about why there's not a whole lot of research on that it's hard to find numbers?
A couple of times we've talked about like research bias, also people not wanting to report their sexuality or their gender identity for personal reasons or for safety reasons. So we've talked a bit about that. We also talked about how that might change in the future. So I'm hopeful, but it's definitely a big issue.
There has been a trend in recent years for both men and women, or people who are non-binary, to describe themselves as bisexual or pansexual. So like there's more young people saying that now than were saying it years ago. And it's made me wonder, is that a reporting thing? Is there more comfort in reporting it? One of my sons made a comment at one point in time. So let's see what y'all educate me and school me on this. He said, "Oh, Mom, a lot of girls are saying they're bisexual because it makes them hot." Should I have done this to him? or should I have like gone, maybe that is a impression management thing? Thoughts?
I think there's a big difference between like performative bisexuality for like the male gaze, I guess, especially pre-COVID at parties or something, you know, like guys would, I don't know, you know, like guys at parties want to see like girls making out because it's like, you know, hot, I guess, to them. And I think that's probably where he's might be coming from.
Might be thinking about that. Yeah, I think it's a good point. And it's almost like, you know, heterosexual men who like to view lesbian porn kind of thing. But then the fantasy, which I've always found to be hilarious, is like, okay, well, they're hot and they're together, but wait until I join the picture. And it's like, no, that's not how that works. But any thoughts about, do you think, well, later on in the book, we're going to get into men's body talk, and there is literature on gay men. Gay men have much higher appearance standards for their partners. And it makes me wonder, like, do men just tend to have these appearance standards regardless of who they're attracted to? But gay men definitely feel more pressure to have their bodies a certain way and to look a certain way than straight men feel that pressure. So in some ways, some of those evolutionary forces seem like they're operating regardless of one's sexual orientation. Any thoughts on that? So does it go beyond the potential reproduction? You know, those forces of like, okay, what we could be doing together could produce kids, whether we're trying for that or not. Those forces seem to be operating in straight couples, but it looks like it's operating somewhat in individuals who don't identify that way.
I think it definitely makes sense that it would like still be happening in like homosexual relationships too, because the things that like make us feminine or like masculine, those hormones and like biological things are still there, whether or not like, you know, you're choosing to use them in a heterosexual relationship or not. You know, you have those hormones that, you know, ours make us more like compassionate and more like apt to be mothers, and you know, masculine hormones make them more like, you know, strong and aggressive. Sometimes, you know, they have a lot of testosterone, so that makes them more in that way. And so you have those hormones that are acting in that way. So it makes sense that those evolutionary things are still happening in those relationships. I guess it's just, you know, a way that you are, it's not, I don't think that it's a choice to be, you know, gay or bi, like, you know, I don't think that you choose, I think that you're born with it. And that's just the way that you are. And so I just think that it's, you know, still there, the evolutionary parts of like the genes and how you were made, I guess.
Okay, that's a good point. Have any of you had the evolutionary psych class where you talked about some of this stuff? I've heard about psych of gender. I hear a lot of people talk about Dr. Ballard's class, by the way. But has anybody had the evolutionary psych course? No, okay. All right, any other thoughts? To add to, I did have one more thought after Sophie's comment. And remember, I told you all the other day that when I got my 2 reviews back after I submitted my first draft, it was obvious that they were feminist individuals, which I can appreciate, but who really disliked evolutionary science. And then I don't even think they read past the first chapter because there wasn't much said about anything else in the rest of the entire book. But years ago, and I don't know the author and I don't even know the name of the book, but it was probably like 20 years ago at this point in time. But there were scientists that produced a book, and it was on the evolutionary biology of rape. And it was met with outrage, which makes sense because there were a lot of feminists, I think, and other individuals who were saying, oh, this is a book justifying rape. And it was, the material in the book from an evolutionary biology standpoint was not at all justification. It was an attempt at explanation, and an attempt at explanation for why most rapes are man on man, man on boy, man on woman or girl. And rarely, it happens, but rarely in the other direction, if that makes some sense. But it helped me, that tension. I remember hearing about the politics of that piece of work many years ago that helped me try to think about like, okay, I'm going to try to use the science to explain fat talk, but I'm not justifying it. I don't want to justify the body snarking. I don't want to justify the fat talk. And one way of thinking about us being more evolved and intelligent, we have the ability to be able to educate and understand things, but not necessarily operate that way, if that makes some sense. And so that's kind of how I tried to think about this, is that, yeah, it is very common and it can seem like it's harmless, and women fall into the fat talk and people fall into the body snarking regularly. But that doesn't mean we should not be very critical of it and try to figure out how to change it. But then I worry, and this is just an ongoing problem when you look in the evolutionary psych literature, that is every single generation going to have to wrestle with fat talk and body snarking? Is every single generation going to have to wrestle with racism and natural racism tendency? Is every generation going to have to wrestle with acceptance of LGBTQ individuals? You know, it's like, is this because of some of our evolutionary wiring? Is this just going to keep on going? And that part makes me really upset thinking about that. You know, like, are we never going to be able to achieve the social justice change and make it just stick and make it easier? You know?
I think a lot of it is taught, though. I know that I took children adolescent psychology, and she had us read a lot about kind of the gender bias as like kindergartners and within kindergartners, and it definitely does exist. But then, like, if you took away that gender aspect of like girls play with this type of toys and boys play with this type of toys, they were way less gender biased, even as like a kid. And so, like, I think gender bias starts as kids, and I think a lot of it is taught too. So I wonder if like we changed our media and changed a lot of those aspects, if people wouldn't have to wrestle with it as much.
That'd be, yes, there's definitely the socialization aspect there, but we're wired to see differences. You know, like we're wired to label people boy or girl. We're wired a bit. I mean, it is taught because it's the first time that happens when a baby's born. And we're wired to be able to distinguish people who, from a racial standpoint, look like us. We can distinguish them better, but we're not as good at being able to distinguish individual differences in people that don't look like us, as an example. So it's kind of like going back to the Langlois stuff and the babies, the viewing the faces of babies. But Jim, I will say that in my family dynamic, I was born, they were hoping for a boy. I was born a girl, and I was treated very much like a girly girl, to the point of where I had to wear my hair and the dresses and all that kind of stuff, until my sister was born, and she was not a boy. When my sister was born, I was allowed to be the tomboy that I was. And I still remember my cousins, we would very frequently go visit my aunt and uncle, my cousins, and there were 3 boys. And I would love to go over to my cousin's house and play with their toys. They had Lincoln Logs, they had Richter sets, they had Legos, you know, and we had dolls. And it was just like, I loved being able to play with the boy toys. And it's one of those, like, so when my kids were little, I made sure that we had stuffed animals and dolls, and we had, you know, stuff that you could build with, but more flexible childhood toys, you know? Yeah. To try to not stereotype those kinds of things. Yeah. Other thoughts or feelings on the evolutionary biology and psychology stuff? We're going to move into culture next week. Who's up next week? Sophie? And there's and Jama? Okay, good. Okay. Will anybody have any other thoughts or comments? Nice job, Emma and Meg, getting us started. I really like the way you all modeled this, of sort of, you had the presentation, but then you would kind of pause and let us see everybody and talk a little bit and then kind of go back. You all were both very good at like doing that. I have to talk to myself still to move back and forth on Zoom to different media and show different media. So yeah, nice job. Nice start. All right, everybody. We'll see you next week. Have a great weekend.
I actually have a question.
Okay.
I'm presenting alone on Tuesday, and so like, does my presentation need to be longer? Like, how do I need to do that?
If we end early, you don't feel bad.
Okay.
But feel free to take up a little more space.
Okay, I'm just worried about it because I feel like we did a lot today, and so I'm wondering like if my section is just gonna be pretty repetitive. And I'll try to bring in new things, but yeah, I didn't know if you had any advice.
You've got the chapter that has the Disney princesses and
No, I have the end of chapter 1.
oh, which is remind me some of the stuff at the end of chapter 1. Oh, I see what you're saying, Jim. You're worried about it being redundant.
Yeah.
Okay. As you work on it, just let me know. I mean,
okay.
But I do think there's probably more that you could pose to them. You know, even if we touched on some of that stuff today. And we're going to find that all throughout the semester, that we're going to be jumping around to different places and content in the book. Another thing you could do if you wanted to, and I don't want you to have to do too much more homework than what everybody else is doing, but pull in some other evolutionary biology and psychology stuff that are on different topics. As an example, I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine when we were on a hike. I think his name is Kendrick or Hendricks, but he does a lot of evolutionary biology research on why older men, particularly after the demise of a relationship or a divorce, prefer younger women. And there's even research, we were talking about this because we were talking about this couple that we knew that broke up, and the man's a professor and he really likes dating younger women. But there's even research to show that men professors have a higher divorce rate than men who are educated that are in other types of jobs.
Interesting.
And it's because, I mean, one way of thinking about it is they're surrounded by a lot of young women.
Yeah, that is very interesting because I was going to ask you about that because I know that since none of us have taken evolutionary psychology, if I shouldn't try to bring some more of that in. And I actually am a natural science concentration, so I deal with a lot of biology. So like I'm very comfortable in that field.
Yeah.
Because that's all I do is natural sciences.
Okay.
So I mean I can try to get some of that in as well.
Well, and even some of the stuff that got discussed today about the hormonal influences, I agree with that. Like, you know, we women, regardless of our sexual orientation, tend to be hormonally different than men. And that has some influence, and it makes some sense that the men, same that kind of thing. So you could even bring in, you know, and explain to us a little bit more of the biology, since that's a strength of yours.
Yeah. I can definitely work and try to. I'm in biological psychology like right now. And so I can try to see if there's anything from that class that I could pull from Dr. Zurl, but he does a lot of, it's not as much with like gender and relationships as much. It's a lot about diseases and pathways.
He has taught in the past a gender of brain biology course. I mean, so he knows a lot about that. It's just not necessarily in his standard biology course. But there's a lot out there on that. And I think that would be really interesting for people to hear about. And again, a lot of that stuff, it's kind of like that book, you know, the evolutionary biology of rape. It's like, you know, there's some stuff that we come into this world with that is going to create behavioral tendencies for us, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how we have to operate all the time.
Yeah.
But feel free to pull in some more of that biological stuff, more of that evolutionary stuff. And then I think you could even, like, depending on whatever the topic you bring in, you could, you know, ask at some point, does this have anything to do with Fat Talk?
And try to wrap it back around.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can try to see if I can find some research over the weekend. If I am struggling, I'll reach out to you.
Okay.
But yeah, I just want to ask that I didn't want it to be too redundant, especially since I have the end of chapter 1. And one thing I did want to ask you is my pages are actually different than what you have on the syllabus because I have the Kindle version. I don't know why that changed it. Yeah.
So you did you email me yesterday about this, or is that somebody else?
I think it's someone else.
Okay.
Because I just figured I would just talk to you today.
Yeah, because so it was somebody else yesterday, and I was like, oh no, I bet you a bunch of you have the Kindle.
Yeah.
And what's that gonna do? So you've got.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure which pages I actually had, so I wanted to make sure of that too.
Let me look on the syllabus. Let me pull that up. Yeah, give me a second here, Jean. And then while I'm pulling that up, I'm going to look at something here too. Okay. So let me scroll. Do you like your Kindle? Do you like reading on that?
It was actually a gift. I don't think I would have ever bought myself one. But my brother's like long-term girlfriend, she's really sweet. And she bought me a Kindle because she was like, you love to read and you travel a lot. And I used to always like bring like 3 books with me. And she's like, this is an easy way to like take a whole bunch of reading with you and like not take a whole bunch of space. And so I really enjoyed it in the aspect of travel and also sometimes cheaper books. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. See, for the travel, there's just some, I guess I am old school. I mean, I spend so much time on the computer, but I love flipping pages. Yeah.
I also love books. Like I love books. And so if it's like something that I'm really passionate about, or if it's like a book that I'm reading for fun, I'm probably going to get the hardback. Like my family, every Christmas, we go to a bookstore together and we pick out books all together, like